I've got news for you.
Welcome to CitizenView. We're the two teachers.
Where citizens come to talk.
Andy, last week we talked about why we hold national party conventions. Of course, this week we've been watching the Republican National Convention in Tampa. We're still talking about political party conventions.
We're talking about those conventions, and we're talking about all those images that pour in to this huge audience of tens of millions of Americans who maybe for the first time in the political season are listening to the candidates deliver a national address.
Andy, I remember back in 1964 when Barry Goldwater was the Republican nominee. I remember watching those conventions. I remember in 1972, John Chancellor on NBC saying, "We have to televise these conventions because they are so important." Andy, are they really?
Well, the conventions have historically lasted for 4 weeknights. They used to take place in the middle of the summer. Increasingly now they take place around Labor Day weekend, before and after. And we've seen the last two Republican conventions, they've actually been able to cut it down to 3 days. I think eventually we'll see these conventions last probably a day, maybe two, because there's such a big event and there is so much media televising them. They're huge endeavors. But fascinating to watch. Again, the visuals. I think we should talk about the visuals.
Well, let's be reminded that they go back into the 1800s, and their intent was quite noble. The smoke-filled rooms, the party caucuses used to choose these nominations, and there was a lot of confusion. It really was the anti-Masonics party in 1831 who held the first national party convention in Baltimore. The Democrats at that point felt like, hey, what a great idea. This is a friend to democracy movement. But Andy, you're right. I remember Ted Koppel saying, what was it, 1996? These aren't political conventions, it's one big infomercial. No doubt about it, a lot of visuals, a lot of scripts, and a lot of pictures trying to influence our votes.
Well, the last convention that really mattered with a dramatic question of who was going to be the nominee took place in Chicago in 1968 with the Democrats because of the tragic assassination of Bobby Kennedy, who was expected to be the nominee. The Democrats came into the convention not knowing who was going to come out as the Democratic challenger to Richard Nixon. And you saw fighting on the streets of Chicago related to the anti-war movement. You saw fighting on the floor of the convention because people had that deep set emotions about which direction the Democrats should go.
Well, if these conventions are the theater of democracy, yes, you would expect some contention. You would expect a little verbal spatting. You would expect some surprises. Not a whole lot of surprises this week other than the Ron Paul delegates trying to have their voices heard, but even that maybe looked a little bit staged to me.
Well, right. After 1968, the parties wanted to stage their nomination process more. And so both parties used primary elections much more to pick those delegates coming to the conventions. And because we knew that Mitt Romney was going to be the Republican nominee de facto as of March or April, it really doesn't have the drama of yesteryear's conventions. However, the speeches are important. This is the first time that they're delivering a national speech, and the visuals are important. Is the party enthused, or are they just going through the motions?
Of course, here in Chicago, we kind of get excited because no city has held more national party conventions than Chicago. And we think back to 1860 and that wigwam, this amazing, almost temporary structure built to house over 10,000 delegates for the Republican National Party Convention. And who came from the bottom up to the top to be that nominee? None other than Abraham Lincoln. So these conventions have a certain nostalgia to them as building support from the grassroots up for candidates. It's democracy's greatest theater, and as we watch this week again, we're wondering if that theater is about to be changed.
Well, speaking of theater, any theater has a stage. I know you and I have both been to several political conventions. I've been fortunate enough to be on the floor of several of these conventions. I'm always struck by how the stage is different between the Democratic Party convention and the Republican convention. I know typically that Democratic Party convention, the stage is huge, it's monstrous, really as a stage for so many of the different factions that are part of the Democratic Party's big tent.
Well, it's interesting, Andy, as we talk in our classes this week about foundations of government and legitimacy and authority. and how we teach that legitimacy isn't found in tradition. It's not found in personality. It's really found rooted in the rule of law. But when we watch these political conventions, when we watch democracy in action, it's not about so much what we hear. It is about what we see. Personality is playing more and more of a role in our democracy, and these conventions certainly show that.
And you hear that a lot with the commentators saying that Mitt Romney needs to use this speech to connect to the American people, to show who he really is, or that Joe Biden, having gone through kind of a rough patch here, needs to reconnect with the voters. Because, yes, we know that elections over the last 40, 50 years, especially presidential elections, have become much more personal, much more a measurement of the values and character of the candidates rather than their party stances.
No big surprise, Andy. They say this political campaign has gone into the gutter. It's gone so negative. Watching these conventions, it's less about what we hear, but that gut feeling in what we feel. Andy, these conventions certainly reveal a whole lot about a modern democracy. This is CitizenView, and we're the two teachers.
No fancy words, no fancy suits.
Plain talk about issues you need to know.
Just in time.